good afternoon to all of you. On behalf of the organizing committee of this memorial lecture, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this 20th Professor C. Chandrasekaran Memorial Lecture, organized by International Institute for Population Sciences. Let me specifically welcome Professor Peter McDonald, who is the speaker today, Professor Caste James, Director of the Institute, Professor K. Srinivasan, distinguished guests, invitees, faculty, staff, and students, and ladies and gentlemen. I will take a few minutes on this occasion, I will take a few minutes to highlight some of the major contributions of Professor C. Chandrasekaran as a pioneer demographer. He was a pioneer demographer in many respects who made very significant contribution to demography in India and elsewhere. He was the director of the DTRC, the Demographic Training and Research Center, now known as IIPS, from 1959 to 1965. And as the director in the initial years of this institute, he gave the direction of the shaping the growth and development of IIPS as the first demographic training center in the Asia Pacific region. And that was one of his major contributions. Professor C. Chandrasekaran, along with the Professor Deming, developed the well-known Chandra-Deming formula that provide better estimates for vital events. This technique based on the dual record system was a real innovation that time, which is continuously being used by the sample registration system in India. Another important contribution of Professor C. Chandrasekaran was, he was mainly instrumental in initiating and conducting the well-known Mysore population study in the early 50s, which was jointly undertaken by Government of India and United Nations. This pioneering study brought to light the interrelationship between socio-economic factors and population changes. And the first time we got some idea about the knowledge, practice, and attitude towards family planning, both from the rural as well as the urban residents. Professor Chandrasekaran obtained his PhD from University of London in 1938, and he also studied at the School of Hygiene and Public Health at the Johns Hopkins University. Chandrasekaran was the population advisor at the ESCAP Bangkok and was also associated with the World Bank, UNFPA as a population scientist. In fact, he was one of the first Indian entrants as a staff member of the population division of the United Nations. He became the president of the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population, IUSSP. He was the president from 1969 to 1973. And IUSP is one of the largest and the most influential body of demographers across the world. Professor Chandrasekaran's autobiography, The Life and Works of a Demographer, which was published in 1999, which really traces the growth and development of demography as a discipline in India. And after his retirement, he decided to settle down at Bangalore, where he set up the Applied Population Research Trust in order to promote, and which was involved in many programs to promote demographic research in India. I remember I had many opportunity to meet him as a young PhD scholar in Bangalore, to go and discuss with him. And he was very kind and considerate to young researchers. So to deliver this 20th Dr. C. Chandrasekaran Memorial Lecture, we have with us one of the eminent demographers of our time, who was also a former president of IOSSP, Professor Peter McDonald today. Thank you, Professor McDonald, for accepting our invitation and joining with us today. And let me once again welcome all the participants, guests, invitees, students, faculty for this memorial lecture. Now I invite Professor James, Director of IIPS, to chair this session and also introduce our guest speaker today. Thank you all. And over to Professor James.
Thank you, Professor Shekhar, Professor Peter McDonald, Professor Srinivasan, distinguished invitees, and ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon and perhaps good evening to Peter, and welcome all of you once again to this Professor C. Chandrasekaran Memorial Lecture. It's indeed a great pleasure to welcome particularly Peter McDonald, who has kindly agreed to deliver this lecture today on a very, very important topic, which all of us look forward to your talk, Peter, on low fertility, its origin and implications. Perhaps India was never considered low fertility as an issue for the last several decades, and we have always been at the overpopulation kind of a mindset for several decades. Perhaps, some of the recent data and recent changes what we see across different parts of the country perhaps also leads direction to what is forthcoming for the country in terms of demographic changes, in terms of the family structure changes, also in terms of what is really going to happen within the society. So to give a few data perhaps, because the recently held National Family Health Survey 5 has shown that the fertility level has gone below replacement level. For the nation as a whole, it is 2. But if you really look at the last census 2011, which is the latest census available for the country, you can say almost 6% of the districts in this country has a fertility level even below 1.5%, 1.5 TFR. You know that the districts in India is perhaps sometimes as big as many countries of the world. So that way, actually, the transition which is sweeping in this country and the changes which is happening in this country and the changes which is happening in the society is unprecedented. Perhaps some even remark it as one of the, perhaps the biggest social revolution which is happening, a silent social revolution which is happening in the demographic front, perhaps goes unnoticed many times by the many other social scientists. I think that way we really indeed grateful to Peter to taking up this topic, and we will look forward to your lecture. I don't know whether we need an introduction of Peter to this community because he's well known. Currently, Peter is the Emeritus Professor of Demography in the School of Demography, College of Arts and Social Sciences in the Australian National University. He was associated for a long time. So he also had a PhD from Australian National University and honors in degree in economics and statistics from the University of South Wales. So Peter has held very, very prestigious positions. I think some of it has been mentioned by Professor T.V. Shekhar. He was the president of the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population. He was associated with World Fertility Survey, while Chandrasekaran was really sort of inventor in the Mysore population studies. Peter was also the fellow of Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and also inaugural public policy fellow of the Australian National University. In 2008, he was appointed as a member of the Order of Australia, one of the prestigious positions he has held. In 2015, he has received Irene B. Tauber Award, a major award given by the Population Association of America. He was the Deputy Director of the ARC Center for Excellence in Population Aging Research, and so on and so forth. If I start reading out all those things, I think perhaps we might not get so much of insight from Peter on this topic. In addition to that, I think Peter has a wide range of interest in demography. Perhaps that is what remarkably distinguished Peter from many other demographers. He worked extensively in migration. He had a lot of work in the area of fertility. He has also worked in social policy and also in labor, family demography, and so on and so forth. So it's a wide range of topics which we discuss. And perhaps I always think that the biggest contribution, not really contribution in that sense, but biggest perhaps the contribution which he has given to the discipline of demography is because his passion for the demography. I know your paper, which is written on the future of demography or the future of the demographic discipline, and actually has been read by hundreds and thousands of people really to see what is really happening, the discipline of demography in this world, as well as particularly in the context of Asia. So it is indeed our great pleasure, Peter, to welcome you, as well as kindly agreeing to deliver this lecture. We look forward to your talk, and without wasting much of any of your time, let me now invite Peter McDonald to deliver the talk on the low fertility, its origin and its implications. Over to you, Peter.
Okay, well, hello everyone, and I'm speaking to you from Northcote in Melbourne, and here I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, the traditional custodians of the land where I am, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm very honoured to have been invited to present the 20th Professor C. Chandrasekaran Memorial Lecture, and I want to thank Professor James and Dr. Sekar and the International Institute for Population Sciences for inviting me to address you today. As has been indicated, the topic of the lecture is low fertility, origins and implications, and I've been working on low fertility now for over 20 years. It's a major interest of mine, and it is timely as India's fertility rate has just edged below replacement level. And so good timing maybe for this lecture. Now, just going back in time, in 1967, I had my first experience of international demography when I attended the IUSSP Asian Regional Population Conference in Sydney, Australia. I'd been studying demography for just a few months at the time, when my ANU instructor, Professor W.D. Borrie, eminent Australian demographer, organised for me to attend the conference. He probably thought it would stimulate my interest in the field. I think he was probably right. Professor Chandrasekaran was an important contributor to that conference. I tell the story to show that I have a very long Chandra history. 2 years later, Professor Chandrasekaran, as we've heard, became the first Asian president of the IUSSP. Now, the 1967 conference in Sydney occurred at a time when the major concern in the field of demography was the high rates of population growth in developing countries, resulting from continually high fertility rates. At the 1967 conference, the decline of fertility in Japan was very apparent, and there were strong signs of decline in Hong Kong and Singapore, and tentatively in South Korea. But the dominant story was one of continuing high fertility in Asian countries. So can I have the slides up now? Thank you. The Indian total fertility rate in 1967 remained as high as 5.8 births per woman. The world fertility rate at the time, in 1967, was 5.0. So can I have the next slide? The next slide, please. Yeah. So here's a projection of the world population from 1970, assuming constant fertility from 1970. That is, that if the TFR had have remained at 5 children per woman, 1970 until 2025, in 2025 the world's population would have been 15.5 billion. And so we're actually half of that, roughly, or a little over half of that. So you can see what a huge difference has occurred to the potential world population just in this relatively short period. And you can see that by the age structure there, that we would have had a tremendously young age structure as well, with massive potential for future growth. The dominant theoretical paradigm in 1967 was demographic transition theory. As is well known to you, the theory stated that in the historical past, there had been a balance between high fertility and high mortality. By 1967, this balance had fallen out of alignment with substantial falls in mortality, but continuing high fertility. However, according to demographic transition theory, with industrialization and urbanization, fertility would fall as well, and a new balance would emerge. Low mortality would be balanced by replacement level fertility, and hence approximately zero population growth. Demographic transition theory is a theory of demographic equilibrium. The notion that logically equilibrium, or zero population growth, must prevail in the long term. In fact, I think it's equally plausible to describe demographic history as chaotic. Periods and places of rapid growth and periods and places of rapid population decline. However, there's no doubt that from 1750 to 1970, the world experienced unprecedented population growth. It was also obvious in 1970 that continued high fertility was unsustainable, as indicated by the slide that's on your screen right now. Broadly in 1970, there was strong support for lowering of the prevailing fertility rates. It was at this time that zero population growth movements got moving, and Malthus was reincarnated in the form of the limits to growth literature. But the issue was, how could fertility rates be lowered? Consistent with the catchphrase, development is the consistent with the catchphrase. Okay, development is the best contraceptive. Demographic transition theory postulated that development preceded fertility decline. However, in 1958, Cole and Hoover published their model of the Indian economy, showing that a fall in fertility would produce an economic benefit. This benefit was later termed the demographic dividend. In short, if fertility fell, countries and couples would redirect resources to economic development and away from the support of ever-increasing numbers of children. This would lead to a concentration of the population in the working ages and hence greater scope for development. Countries and families could focus on raising the quality of children rather than their quantity. This was an argument for fertility decline as a stimulus to economic development, not the reverse. So development first, then fertility decline, or fertility decline first and then development. This was effectively the theme of the 1974 World Population Conference. However, in advance of this conference, numerous developing countries, especially in Asia, had implemented family planning programs. Eager for development, they had been convinced by the Cole and Hoover argument, largely by academic demographers, the United Nations, the Population Council, and belated the US government. Many of the leaders of these national family planning programs had academic training in the United States, and on their return to their home countries, they pursued fertility reduction with great gusto. On the ground in Indonesia during the 1970s, I witnessed the rapid fall in fertility in a country that was still largely poor and lowly educated. Subsequent fall in fertility in most Asian countries was much more rapid than had been projected by the UN around 1970. Subsequent research by Bloom and Williamson have demonstrated that somewhere between 25 and 40% of economic growth in the Asian tiger countries between 1970 and 1986 was due to the demographic dividend that lower fertility produced. And interestingly, in 1979, China introduced its one-child policy on the basis that it would produce a demographic dividend that would stimulate the economy. So the one-child policy has the same origin as the family planning programs in all of the other developing countries in Asia. As had been the case in the early Western fertility decline in Asia occurred primarily through couples stopping having any more children, rather than through changes in starting or stopping behaviour. Very large families were the first to disappear. This points to a latent demand for fertility control as the primary driving force. And this latent demand came very largely from women, who were not enthusiastic about the prospect of constant childbearing and many mouths to feed. This latent demand was bolstered by the information campaigns associated with family planning programs. Family planning programs were directed at women, and women took control of their own fertility. The next slide, please. And so fertility fell to replacement level in Asia and Latin America, implying near zero growth of population in the longer term, all in accordance with demographic transition theory. And this graph of fertility looks very like the demographic transition theory. But demographic transition theory did not envisage that a small number of children and control over their own fertility would be part of a revolution in women's lives. Since 1970, there has been a global expansion of education levels, especially for women. Next slide, please. Okay, well, this is a slightly complex slide, but it's an index of female education based on the age group 25 to 29. And the index is done for 146 countries in this graph. It's constructed by multiplying the percentage of women aged 25 to 29 who have various levels of schooling, no schooling incomplete as in the table there, multiplying it by the weight that's in the second column. So if every woman had, if 100% of women had completed tertiary education, the index would be 600. Of course, if 100% had no schooling, it would be 0. So it ranges from 0 to 600. And what I've done here is to graph the distribution across time in ranked order of those 146 countries of the level of the index. And so the grey one, which goes back to 1970, shows relatively low levels of education. But then between 1970 and 1990, there's a very big increase. This is across the world. It's a global increase, but particularly in a wide range of middle countries. And then further increase to 2010. It's showing a huge increase in female education for 25 to 29. By the time you get to 2010, the last year, that's based on census data, so last year you can do this, the countries with the two highest levels of education for women aged 25 to 29 were both Asian countries. And that's the Republic of Korea and Singapore at the highest levels of education for women in the world. But also in 1970, in this age group, women were more educated than men in just 7% of countries. So men had more education than women in 93% of the countries in this table. In 2010, however, women had more education than men in 65% of countries. Well, 2/3 of countries, the women were more educated than the men of the same age, 25 to 29. Now, at the time of the Asian Regional Conference in 1967, women's labour force participation rates were relatively low, even in the more advanced countries. In contrast, today, education provides the potential for young women to be engaged with the labour force, as engaged with the labour force as young men are. It's the potential. Educated couples today are very well aware of the economic benefits of having two incomes. When education levels were low and few women had paid employment, and most had many children, the opportunity cost of a woman of having a child was low. But today, without support, even 2 children are an obstacle to the pursuit of a career for women, especially when the children are small. In terms of gender equity theory, women today have considerable opportunity in individually oriented institutions such as education and paid employment, but their opportunities are much reduced if gender equity for mothers is low in family-oriented institutions such as the family itself, the working conditions, and the tax and social security systems. When gender equity rises to high levels in individually oriented institutions, when the opportunities are there for women to succeed in employment and education, but they still remain low in family-oriented institutions, and fertility will fall to very low levels. Rather than the fall in fertility ceasing at 2 children per woman, as had been postulated in demographic transition theory, fertility has continued to fall to levels below replacement, here termed low fertility. Have the next slide, please. For the past 20 or 30 years, a framework has been used to explain the observed dichotomy between Western countries that had very low fertility rates, under 1.5, and those that had only moderately low fertility rates, between 1.5 and 2.0. The Southern European and German-speaking countries had very low fertility, while the Nordic, English-speaking and French and Dutch-speaking countries had moderately low fertility. In the countries with moderately low fertility, governments and employers provided supports to enable mothers to work. In the countries with very low fertility, these supports were not provided. Ironically, the countries with very low fertility were countries that considered themselves to be family-oriented, but this took the political meaning that governments should stay out of the lives of families. So there's a delay of first births, of course, going on for a long time. The delay of first births is common to all these, but the delay of first births is common to all of the countries in the slide there. However, it's been shown that countries with very low fertility have a low level of recuperation following the delay of first births, while those with moderately low fertility have relatively strong levels of recuperation, because they have policies or institutions that enable women to combine work with family. And almost incongruously, in OECD countries today, there is a positive relation between fertility and women's employment. And there are two main contexts. That's showing you these English-speaking countries and the context of the different countries with higher, moderately low and very low fertility. And I've described some of them, but there are two other main contexts where low fertility has been experienced. First, the Eastern and Central European countries, where fertility had been moderately low to 1990, experienced a rapid fall to very low fertility rates after 1990, as prior economic systems came under pressure and previous supports for families were diminished. As economic circumstances have improved, and as supports for family with children increased, fertility rates in East and Central Europe countries have tended to rise, with a few exceptions. These trends are consistent with the standard arguments that have been made to explain the bifurcation in the slide on the screen. The other main context, which is actually on the screen there, is the wealthy East Asian countries, including Singapore, and they've had the lowest fertility rates ever experienced. And now China has joined them, with its fertility rate now heading under 1.3. The gender equity argument for very low fertility is very strong in East Asia. Also, the emergence of short-term work contracts that create uncertainty about the future for young people has been cited as a reason for delay of marriage and very low fertility. Finally, especially in East Asia, as demonstrated by Mary Brinton, employers demand that workers provide absolute dedication to the company. Dedication to the company involves long hours of work and workers being available upon the whim of the company. In a sense, the employers see their workers as their property, and family beyond the company gets very short shrift. Attention paid to children is almost seen as disloyalty to the company. And it is instructive that employers in East Asia have fought tooth and nail to block attempts by government to change these working conditions. Companies and shareholders are more concerned with their short-term profits than with building the longer-term future markets and labour forces that they will need in the future that children would provide. Effectively, these companies are contributing to their own demise in the longer term, unless, of course, they move to another country where there's lots of children. Beyond these more advanced countries, low fertility is now emerging in more and more contexts. India, as we just heard, Bangladesh, Iran, Malaysia, Thailand, and most Latin American and Caribbean countries. Today, over 100 countries have below replacement fertility. In all these countries, the age at first birth has been increasing continually, and so tempo effects on period fertility can't be ignored. But births presently delayed may be made up or recuperated in the future. But as slide 5 shows there, it shows not just period fertility, but cohort fertility. Cohort fertility is below replacement level in most of the contexts shown in the slide, which means that tempo tempo effects, if they start to come in, will not have a big impact. So next slide, please. Okay, now there's a new trend. Fertility has moved sharply downwards in most of the countries that had sustained moderately low fertility in the past. So we saw in that previous slide that this group of countries that are on screen were the countries that had moderate fertility rates, not such a problem. But fertility in the last few years has been falling very sharply in all of those countries, pretty much, and particularly in Finland, which is quite noticeable. What explains this new trend? There's been a renewed surge in the delay of first births, so there's lots of movement down in the fertility rates in the 20s, ages 20 to 29. This implies a strengthening of tempo effects, but as first births occur later and later, the opportunities for recuperation diminish. In most of these countries, age-specific fertility rates are falling at ages 30, 31, 32, which were formerly ages of recuperation. Also, most studies indicate that cohort fertility is continuing its long-term downward trend, and higher percentages of women will have no children. A potential explanation consistent with the conventional explanation that I've given before is that as each successive generation of women becomes more highly educated and more able to compete in the labour market than previous generations, they require increasingly more and more support to achieve their career aims and have children as well, including support from their partners, their employers, and from government. Young women today are more highly educated than young men in all these countries in that graph, and labour demand is continually shifting in the direction of jobs in which women are more commonly employed. This means that for women, the opportunity cost of having children keeps rising, and the need to offset that cost keeps getting more and more intensive. As argued in the low fertility trap hypothesis, as high percentages of women have no children, the opportunity costs rise for those who do have them. It's also been argued that this new downward trend of fertility is due to many young people today being pessimistic about their futures because of economic and political insecurity and climate change. And COVID has contributed to this, added to this sense of insecurity. But it may also be the case that for increasing proportions of young people, having children has lower salience in their lives. Perhaps when young people report in surveys that they would prefer to have 2 children, many are merely expressing the socially acceptable response, the response that is in keeping with the idealised family morality of the society. We know that in Japan, for example, most young people still express a desire to have children, or to have 2 children, but 30% of women completing the childbearing years have not had a baby. If a stronger dedication to employment over family has emerged, will the experience of work under COVID alter the situation? I'm talking about longer-term effects of COVID, not the short-term disruptive effects. There are stories of large numbers of workers in the United States walking away from their jobs in apparent rejection of workism, the belief that work is the centerpiece of one's identity and life purpose. Many workers, men and women, are negotiating work from home for, say, 2 to 3 days per week. Okay, so that's about the origins of low fertility. I'm now going to move on to the implications of very low fertility, particularly of looking at very low fertility. That's fertility under 1.5. Countries newly reaching replacement level fertility, like India, have existing age structures that provide for future growth of population, even when fertility is below replacement. However, with sustained below replacement fertility, this momentum will disappear in about 30 years, after which the population size will begin to fall. The UN has the population of some 31 countries falling between 2020 and 2025. The fall in population size is often welcomed, even advocated, on the argument that the world has too many people and that fewer people would assist in addressing climate change and environmental degradation. It's also suggested that higher levels of human capital can compensate for declining labour supplies. Now, these are reasonable arguments if population change is moderate. But as it was in the moderately low fertility countries. But as I shall demonstrate, with sustained very low fertility, population change is not moderate, it is dramatic. This is recognised by governments. Based on the regular United Nations survey of governments, only about 20% of governments in countries with fertility between 1.5 and 2.5 want to increase their fertility rate, compared with 85% of countries where fertility is below 1.5. So about 30 countries have fertility rates below 1.5. If very low fertility is desirable for various reasons or is not a problem, why do so many governments think that this is not the case? Now, here I'm going to discuss three implications of very low fertility at the macro level: population ageing, labour supply, and ageing of the labour force, and finally population decline. But the relative absence of children will also change the nature of society. Next slide, please. I'm going to use the Republic of Korea as a case study, and it's because it has the lowest fertility rate of any country in the world. And what I've shown on the screen here is the total fertility rate of Korea to 2020. In 2020, Korea's fertility rate was 0.84, well below 1. In their projections, the United Nations Population Division, I'm going to use the United Nations assumed constant rate of fertility projection for Republic of Korea. But in that projection, the fertility rate of Korea is taken as 1.11, and it's already way below that at 0.84. So what I'm going to show you is better than the reality if fertility were to stay at 0.84. The illustrations that I'm presenting are not necessarily what will happen in the Republic of Korea, only what would happen if fertility was constant at 1.1 births per woman. Now, starting with population ageing, when population declines because of low fertility, it does not decline evenly across the age structure of the population. It declines at the youngest ages. Population numbers continue to grow at the older ages, whilst numbers fall at the young ages. The speed of population ageing is determined by the speed of the previous fertility decline. The extent of population ageing, how far we go in terms of ageing, is determined by how far fertility falls, how low fertility is. In this regard, China's population ageing stands out because it has had a very rapid fertility decline, and fertility has now fallen to a very low level. Next slide, please. Okay, this shows, this is an age pyramid, essentially, showing the aging of the population of Korea, assuming constant fertility, showing those 3 points in time, 2020, 2060, and 2100. And you'll see that as you move, the huge falls in numbers at ages under 60 are clearly evident. That's the blue, moving from the blue to the orange bars. That is from 2020 to 2060, enormous falls in population in those, and in the young working ages in particular. And that continues again to 2100, you get continual falls. But by 2100, your population is also falling at the older age groups as well. Now, next slide, please. Now, this is the dependency ratio defined as shown on the screen. It shows you, it goes from 1950 right through to 2090. And you can see that there was what you might call a demographic onus back from 1950 through to around 1970 and so on, which was the problem that drove family planning programs. It was that demographic onus which led countries to have vigorous family planning programs. And that moved them to the middle section where there was a demographic bonus, where the dependency ratio was very low. And that continues for a period. But in Korea, we moved fairly rapidly towards another demographic onus related to population aging. And the onus is much bigger than it was for the 1950s, 1960s period. It's even larger. The other factor to note is that this dependency ratio kind of understates dependency because it applies equal consumption weights to all ages. So let's have a look at slide 10. Next slide, please. Yeah. These are the age-specific consumption. This is age-specific consumption relative to consumption at age 40. So age 40 is taken as 1. And it shows the relative consumption at younger ages and older ages. And there's a lot of noise at the younger ages, with some countries focusing incredibly upon education in Japan and South Korea. Excuse me, but looking at the older ages, you can see that the countries that have developed aged care type programs and health programs, Japan, the USA, the expenses of the older population are quite high compared to India, where consumption is pretty flat. These are national transfer account data. But interestingly, in the country we've been looking at, South Korea, it's also quite flat. But South Korea doesn't have expensive old people yet because it doesn't have quite the same programs as its neighbor, Japan. Next slide, please. Now, if you take account of that consumption, the reddish of the brownie line there is what we saw before, dependency ratio moving in Korea between 2020 to 2080. That's but if you adjust it by waiting for I use a model pattern based on Japan to weight the ages, you can see that the dependency problem is somewhat bigger when you do that. Interestingly, at the end, the 2080, the two curves come together, and that's because by 2080 you've got a stable population and the age structure is not changing. Next slide, please. Okay, well, let's now consider labour force changes. Just in summary, if low fertility is sustained in the long term, population ageing presents a severe challenge that's not easily dismissed. So let's deal with labour force changes. With low fertility and constant age and sex labour force participation rates, the numbers in the labour force will fall relatively quickly and the labour force would become older. Now here's South Korea's labour force, using South Korea's labour force age and sex labour force participation rates and constant fertility of 1.1, what would happen to the Korean labour force. And you can see that in 80 years, South Korea's labour supply would fall to less than 40% of its current size. In addition, the percentage of the labour force aged less than 40 would fall from 35% to 25%. between 2020 and 2055. Now, it's hard to see this as being sustainable. Next slide, please. Okay, this is taken from The Economist magazine, and it relates to Southeast Asia. The Economist considers falling labour supply to be a negative trend, to be a negative thing. And the South Korean scenario just presented is much more severe than the trend in any Southeast Asian country. At the macro level, there are questions about the capacity of ongoing economies to adjust to rapid falls in the supply of labour. Wage inflation is an obvious potential outcome, and this would have a bearing on the country's international competitiveness. Some argue that the effects of a declining workforce can be offset by increases in labour productivity arising from new technology in particular and higher levels of education. And robots are an example that's used. Japan has demonstrated this to a large extent, with a long period of low fertility, but still keeping its economy going. But the counter-argument to this is that the countries with both high labour productivity and a relatively high employment to population ratio will have the highest standards of living. So while a country may be able to cope for a while with higher labour productivity, the country next door that has will have the same higher labour productivity, but relatively high employment, but has relatively high employment to population ratios, it's going to do better. They will have the robots and the highly skilled workers. Their international competitiveness will be stronger. Many of the studies that are done on this kind of issue focus just on one country, and you can't do that. You've got to look at international competitiveness and the extent to which other countries will do better than you. Countries faced with falling labour supply could propose higher labour force participation rates at older ages, and lots have done that, for example, by increasing pension eligibility ages. But these moves have met with strong political resistance in many countries, particularly in Europe. People want to think that they can be relieved of constant toil when they reach older ages, like me. South Korea already has very high labour force participation rates for older age men, the highest in the OECD, and so the scope for this approach is very limited in South Korea. But there is considerable scope in many Asian countries, including South Korea, to increase labour force participation rates for women. But this would lead to even lower fertility unless the combination of work and family were supported at a much higher level than is presently the case. The age of the labour force also matters. With each successive generation, young workers are the holders and assimilators of new technology because of the recency of their education. They are the economy's complex problem solvers. Young workers and older workers are complementary. They're not substitutes for each other. Capital will flow to the innovative countries, that is, the countries with the younger workforces. So the ageing of the labour force is also problematic. In summary, it is the speed and extent of decline of the labour force that matters. Slow declines can probably be accommodated, but substantial and rapid declines spell danger for an economy. Now I'm going to move on to population decline briefly. If the total fertility rate is 1, then each successive generation is half the size of the previous generation, and a demographic generation is about 30 years. If we start with generation 0, generation 1 is half its size, generation 2 is a quarter of its size, and generation 3, after just 90 years, is 1/8 of the size of generation 0. And remember, Korea's fertility is actually below 1. With very low fertility, population can fall just as rapidly as it rose. From a global perspective, there are many countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where the populations will expand massively during this century. We're in an interesting period when some countries have massive population growth while others having population decline. But because of that massive growth of population in sub-Saharan Africa, there will be no shortage of Homo sapiens. And there's still a lot of population growth to go in India. But this is no... It's there's no comfort to subspecies of Homo sapiens facing dramatic decline in their numbers. Now, if you think about the species of marsupial, it's no comfort. It's in Australia. It is no comfort. Okay, let me start again. It's no comfort to subspecies of Homo sapiens facing dramatic decline in their numbers, but the numbers are rising in African countries. If you think about the species of marsupials in Australia, it's no comfort to the declining numbers of koalas that there are lots of kangaroos. Finally, just as a final comment, changes in society. Population also produces major shifts in the composition of domestic markets. For example, decline in demand for goods and services related to children and young people. Where very low fertility is due to societal institutional constraints rather than desires of young people for children, very low fertility is an assault upon their rights. We have no experience of societies in which children are infrequent. Finally, what can we say about the nature of a society that cannot even reproduce itself? Thank you. So we're ready for questions. If you
Thank you, Peter. It has been such an exciting talk, and it has given us so much of wealth of information as well as ideas to take it forward. And you have touched upon first on the public policy interventions and how far it really some impact at least in increasing the levels of fertility in some countries, and how actually other countries have really been behind in those kinds of policies. And also later part you have dealt intensively on the implications of it, not only in terms of aging, but in terms of workforce, in terms of generational changes, as well as in terms of what is really going to happen to the society as a whole, taking examples from the South Korea. I know that there's a lot of things to perhaps to ponder about, because this is a reality which perhaps is looming in front of many countries, including India now. So we really need to see what best policy interventions would help it. Maybe I will just ask a sort of a query, not a questions, because especially on the public policy interventions on it. Because there is also a alternative views on that, whether really you need to have public policy to change your demographic behavior, because why don't the society, the economy, the society adjust to the demography rather than demography adjusting to the society? So what should be adjusted? That is what some people many times argue, because in the overpopulation time, it was the demography who has been asked to adjust because you wanted an economy and society to change in a certain shape. But even in the low fertility situation, should demography adjust, or whether the society or the economy adjust? So what is your, I think it's a larger question, but perhaps I would like to hear from you. What would be perhaps your take on that question?
Well, this was interestingly, as I pointed out, this was exactly the same question that was applied in around 1970. Do we wait for the development and let the development influence the demography, or do we use the demography to improve the development? So it's exactly the same question. And I think the answer is the same again. If we're talking about very low fertility, there's a variation across the world. If fertility is 1.8 or 1.7, then everything happens slowly. And adaptation is a distinct possibility, particularly as education levels increase and countries are often very crowded, and some population decline is not such a bad thing. But what I was trying to do here, I use South Korea as an example, Republic of Korea as an example, not because just to show the impacts of very, very low fertility in a kind of real situation. It's not necessarily what's going to happen in South Korea. But if fertility is very low, these changes are the changes in the demography, the changes in the labour force, population agent is quite dramatic and it's quite fast. And I don't think we can wait. I don't think we can adapt to that. So, if countries like India, with fertility falling to 2, should be wary about falling below 1.5. That once fertility falls to very low levels, it is hard to get it to come back up again. There are policy initiatives. There are some examples where there have been some successes, but it's not easy to do. And so it's better to try and stay up in that moderately low fertility area rather than falling to the very low fertility. Of course, countries are going to take on all of the adaptive type of policies. They're not going to stop development. They're not going to stop education. Countries are going to do that. Technology is going to race ahead. So that's going to happen anyway. But it's going to be harder if fertility is at a very low level. You have old labour forces. You've got declining labour forces. It's going to be much harder to do.
Okay, thank you. The participants can either ask their questions in the chat box or the Q&A, which is there in the right side of your screen, or those who have been given access. All of you have not been given access, I know, but those who are given access perhaps can unmute and ask questions directly. Please feel free to ask questions. Yeah.
I might just add, while the questions are coming in, that for some countries, using migration, international migration, is an option. So countries like Canada, Australia, Singapore, New Zealand, international migration makes a very big difference to their age structure. And they can use international migration because their populations are relatively small. But if you wanted to use migration to deal with China's low fertility at 1.3, then you're talking of like 10 million migrants coming into China every year, which is completely impossible. So the use of migration depends on the context.
Perhaps it was possible for South Korea to address it to some extent, is it so? But they didn't attempt that.
Yeah, well, that's right. Particularly in particular labour shortages, and countries in East Asia, Japan and South Korea are moving slowly towards international migration. But the kind of tricky issue is that when fertility is very low, 1.0, and you use migration, then it doesn't take very long for the population to become the migrants and not the original population. Now that's a pretty sensitive kind of thing to say, but it is a reality, and I think that's why a lot of countries are very concerned about very low fertility. That is that their subspecies, Homo sapiens, is on the decline.
Okay, so please feel free to unmute and ask questions. So if there are any questions in the chat box, I will address you, Peter. So those who have been given access can please feel free to unmute and then ask questions.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yes.
Maybe you can introduce yourself and then ask questions.
Well, Peter, good evening. Thanks for this very interesting exposition of low fertility, and you have given an intelligent exploration by taking countrywide example and a global trend. I'm just picking up from your last line, which is very important, that what is that population which cannot replace itself? And in fact, the low fertility implication that you have informed us about is having some roots of implication in the pace of decline and also duration of stability of the population, because the pace of decline dictates the duration. You are also referring to generations. Apart from the exposition that you gave, which are pretty convincing in terms of labor force, in terms of consumption, I was wondering whether you would reflect upon two things. That is, one is low fertility implication to household composition and low fertility implication to inequality in the long run. Because these are two things which have been actually pronounced in the Global Inequality Report in recently, declared about the world reasons about low fertility and inequality. And the second, which is very important, rather than going in pure demographic version, the household composition and implications. I'd be very happy to hear from you. Thanks.
Yeah, well, the household composition clearly, it'll change. That there'll be many more households without children, many more older households, many more single-person households, particularly at older ages. So there'll be very, very major changes in household composition. I don't know whether, they're kind of obvious, I suppose, those kind of changes. Whether you have something more in mind, maybe you can enlighten us later on. But inequality, yes, I think inequality is an issue that those countries that had the moderately low fertility, the Nordic countries and the English-speaking countries, and I showed that recent rapid fertility decline, it's quite strong among the lower socioeconomic strata of those societies. And this is quite a new trend, I think. And and it does suggest that it's stemming from inequality. So if you're a couple where you both are well educated and you both have good jobs and you both have big incomes, you're the ones now having the children. It's easier for you to pay the expenses that are required. That's emerging. That's emerging in particularly in Nordic countries. It's happening here in Australia as well. That the socio-economic differences are starting to narrow very, very dramatically. So that, I think, is at a kind of fertility level, is an impact of inequality. More broadly, as labour forces decline and you get older populations, then a lot of countries do not have good age programs in place at the moment, and they're going to age before they do. And so the situation of older people, well, in those countries will be quite problematic. They won't have the same benefits, access to healthcare and all kinds of care as exists in the richer countries today. So that's another area of inequality, I think, that's important. And then probably in labour forces too, I think. But there's always inequality in the labour force, in a big, big way, huge way. But I think it's probably going to get worse with low fertility. With those really well-off people who can adjust quite well, they're going to do well in the economy, but others will not do so well because their jobs are kind of dependent upon a flatter age structure.
Thanks for your thoughts. Thank you.
I think before others come in, maybe I can ask some of the questions which are raised in the chat box. One was it more of specific to India, because India has achieved a replacement level, but there is a huge heterogeneity as well. So, but there are some states which is intending to do a population control law. Whether it is advisable or what would be your policy prescription for such kind of a strict law, because some of the areas are far away from replacement level fertility.
Yeah, that's the problem. If you've got a kind of national level policy that some areas will have high population growth remaining, while the nation is dropping below replacement. And in India, a bit like China, you can't really look at it as one country in a sense. It's you have to understand it. Those two countries, you have to look at them at that regional level, because the regional differences are big. But certainly, I think in the south of India, where fertility rates are very low, then policy attention, I think, is desirable. As for the areas that have relatively high fertility still, I don't think I would be quite so concerned about that, because as education levels rise for women, their fertility rate's going to come down. That index I had up before of the education of women aged 25 to 29, the correlation coefficient of that index with the total fertility rate is minus 0.86. It's really, really high. So as women's education levels rise, fertility comes down.
Thank you. So please feel free to unmute and ask questions before I look at the chat box again.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, you are
Hello.
your voice
Hello.
is yes, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Can you hear
Yeah,
me?
please. Yes,
Am
please
I
go ahead.
audible?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I'm Professor Srivastav. First of all, Professor McDonald, I would like to thank you very much for your interesting and thought-provoking lecture. It has covered different dimensions of levels and trends of fertility in some of the African Asian countries, including India. Well, what I want to listen from you is, could you please enlighten us about your views regarding comparative picture of levels and trends of fertility in Australia and India in near future?
Well, yes, I think there's a lot of people in this lecture who will have a better idea of the trend in India than I do. So I think I might steer clear of answering that question for India. But as I mentioned before, as women's levels of education rise, the tendency for fertility to fall is very, very powerful, and that's ahead of India, I would say. In Australia for a long time has had that moderately low fertility. Fertility was between about 2.0 and 1.7 total fertility rate for about 35 years straight. And that's a pretty good place to be. And Australia can deal with the slightly below replacement fertility because it has a big migration program. And so although the fertility rate in Australia is below replacement, the number of births has been rising because of migration. But there's this new trend which has got us all interested. That's in the last few years, just a few years, there's been a sudden downward trend in fertility, and this is pre-COVID. And as yet, we don't have a good idea about it, but it is heavily concentrated in the 20 to 29 ages, and much more heavily concentrated among the lowest socioeconomic groups rather than the higher ones who have their children in their 30s, essentially. So if we talk about teenage fertility, then this is a good thing, that if people are no longer having babies as teenagers, that's a good result. But the issue is just how much recuperation there will be from this recent decline. So there's a big delay going on of first births in the 20s. And some of that will be recuperated, absolutely certain. But how far fertility will fall is not easily estimated, but I did an exercise for the Australian government fairly recently, and I said that fertility would probably end up around 1.6 in the longer term, which is still not very low.
Okay, I found the chat box. Terry Hull has asked a question. Terry, perhaps you can unmute and ask questions directly because you have been given that right. Terry, would you like to come in?
Yes, sir. Sir, it was a very interesting lecture. Sir, thank you, sir. Just asking whether this so much attention to this low fertility declining replacement or low fertility, is it because of this right-wing nationalism that is spreading like that? Or we had less number of people earlier also, and there was no problem. Can you please?
Yeah, well, I tried to refer to that, and it is a tricky issue, that I did say that a lot of governments probably where fertility is very, very low, that they support increasing fertility for those nationalistic kind of reasons. They don't like to see a future for their country of rapidly declining population out into the future, which would be the case if fertility remained very low. But I also said, of course, that the world population is not going to fall dramatically by any stretch of imagination. It's going to keep rising. But as I tried to show that it's no great consolation to those whose nationalities are disappearing, that other nationalities are growing very rapidly. So while we continue to have national identification is really, really strong, as a mover of people, it's hard to see it disappearing, and we say, well, it's okay that if our population declines quite dramatically, there's lots of other people in the world.
Okay, Terry, please unmute and come in. Nice meeting you after a long time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. Very well done. I look forward to your discussion of koalas organizing to get migration of kangaroos to maintain the marsupial population. But I think that little anecdote that you put out there, which is related to this issue of conflict among different Homo sapiens, is very important. The issues of caste and class and that are long-term discussions in population studies probably bring a somewhat different tone to the issues of low fertility than what you've opened up as the demographic case. And the question early on about whether you deal with the development or the demography first, it's almost necessary to keep stressing that you have to do both. But I wonder if you could tell us what you think about some of these issues of caste and class and nationalism, which we see right now in Europe playing out before our very eyes, with wars being started between countries with very low fertility.
Yes, well, Ukraine is a country where the population is falling quite fast and it has quite very low fertility. Russia is a country where fertility was very low, 1.3, fell to 1.3. But they then introduced pretty aggressive policy changes, which were effectively cash benefits to people who had babies. And fertility rose to 1.7. But it's starting to head back downwards again to about, it's down to about 1.5 again now. And I was actually involved with, unfortunately, to admit this at the moment, with the Russian government and with the Putin government in that policy change. But caste and class, well, yeah, it's, can't say much more than I've already said. I think that people have a strong attachment, particularly at the national level. There's a lot of national jingoism that goes on, and that I think is important in governments wanting to maintain their, not wanting to see their populations drop dramatically. So yeah, I'll take your comment as a comment.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Professor Peter, I have a question. This is Nandita Saikya, faculty IIPS. I have two questions. First is linked to your second part of your talk, that is implications of low fertility. It has been often argued that low fertility does not necessarily prevent environmental degradation. So, in order to prevent environmental degradation, what do you think, like which approach is more practical in near future? First is like high fertility, but low consumption, like many South African countries have. Then another option can be low fertility, but high consumption, which is seen in South Korea, US, and all those. And the third option, that low fertility and low consumption. So out of these three options, which one can be most practical in near future? And my second question is that, in order to reduce inequality, a very high level of human capital investment from government is needed. And my question is that, in particularly those countries which have high inequality as well as high fertility, and not necessarily the high income countries, low or middle income countries like India, is it possible that per capita human capital investment and to invest a very high per capita human capital investment have in the history of fertility and high income countries, and which have been also experiencing low fertility, what is the findings in this respect? Thank you.
The population and environment, there's no question that the population has an impact on the environment, but most of the impact is not so much the population, but the way the population behaves. Probably about a tenth of CO2 emissions in change is due to population, and 9/10 due to the way that we burn fuel and the way we live. So obviously the way to deal with, but at the same time, when population growth is really, really high, as you see in sub-Saharan Africa, and a lot of that will be in urban areas, the extent of environmental degradation is likely to be pretty good, pretty high, and the need to feed huge numbers of people in sub-Saharan Africa, that's going to have a big impact on environments there. So it's a two-edged sword. Population does have these impacts, and it's clearly better to get population under control in this situation. And it's, as I mentioned, okay, I think, for populations to fall somewhat, particularly in very dense populated countries, but not out of control, like you get when you get very, very low fertility. But also we need to think about sustainable development in the future. One of the big issues, of course, as you all know, with climate change is, it's that a lot of countries are wanting to develop much more than they have now. And it's okay for the rich countries to say, okay, let's shift our energy supplies to something else, and something, while poorer countries may not be able to do that quite so easily. And so a focus on ways, a strong focus on ways to assist poorer countries in sustainable development, I think it's really, really important for the world's future. But with COVID, with the experience of COVID, we've seen that the rich countries are interested in themselves first, and so it's not a good sign. On inequality, human capital. Well, I'm a big fan of human capital development. I think it's the number one thing that countries should be aiming at, and development follows from big investments in education. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we have to also shorten because it's already perhaps going to be 10 o'clock in this place, so we may take a couple of questions more. Yeah, I think DP Singh has been asking. Okay, DP Singh, go ahead.
Yeah, examining this NHS 4-round data, and especially like using that caste as a variable, the estimate of NHS shows that fertility is declining over the 4 round. But what I observed, the most decline has taken place between 2000 and 2005 among especially that all the age group, means all the caste group, whether upper caste and like that. But once it is especially those castes where women were highly educated are better than the other group, whereas the middle groups, which were earlier, we used to call it as occupation-based service caste, they have shown still high fertility. And especially some of the religious group like Christian, Jain, they also show very below replacement, maybe around below 1.4, 1.5 like that. But still some of the castes still they have very high. And when I examine their educational level, that on education also they are little bit lower level. And economic status, which NHS measures based on this wealth index, that also shows a very clear positive relationship with the fertility. So I feel like in India, this economic status and education is still need to be make it much more better. Then only probably all the group will be come back to their normal or more or less the inequality in the TFR will be much less. So I think what you suggest is something.
Yeah, well, hopefully that is the case, but I think it just needs to be monitored. If you look at the experience of many other countries and many other countries in Asia, fertility hit 2 births per woman on average, but it kept going down. And so there are countries like Thailand, for example, where there's pretty big inequalities in the population and relatively low level of development, where fertilities fall under 1.5 and under. So I wouldn't kind of necessarily sit back and think that everything's going to be all right. I think I'd be looking to ensure that, particularly in the area of job security for young people and work and family policies, I think you have to think about those for a future situation.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have to close, so perhaps we will have to take a last question from the chat box. The chat box, I think Smith has asked a question. I don't know if Smith is there, he can unmute and ask this question, or Smith is available here.
Yes, I'm here. It's Len Smith from ANU in Canberra, Australia.
Sure.
Thanks, Peter. Look, as demographers, we're used to doing calculations based on a per person rates. As you say, governments and nationalists may be concerned about the effect of the trends we've been talking about on the size of their population and the size of their economy. But when you think about the total welfare of a society, that really depends on the per capita effects on individuals. Well, what would be the implication of examining the fertility changes from that perspective, as opposed to focusing on the gross size of the population, the gross size of the economy?
Well, I think they're, I think they're quite connected. You know, that if the countries has a strong growth in GDP per capita, then generally people are going to be better off. There are problems today with a lot of that increase in GDP per capita going to the top 1%. But in broad terms, people are better off, you know, when GDP per capita is rising than say when it is potentially falling, and it can fall. And you know, it has fallen in countries like Italy in the past, where labour force participation rates are low and so on. So the other individual level, and talking more broadly about welfare, and I was alluding to it a little bit towards the end of the talk, was that it may be that people want to have children, but there are economic and social constraints, and so that reduces their individual welfare if they're not able to have the children that they want to have. I'm not talking about huge numbers of children, of course, but you know if you wanted to have children, two children, you can't do it. Then that's problematic for welfare at the individual level as well. So I think it's talking about the age population as well, as I did. You know, I think the welfare of older people will be much better in countries that are relatively rich, because there are transfers from governments, you know, in the rich countries, that macro wealth converts into individual well-being, particularly at older ages. So I think it's what I've been saying is consistent, although I focused, as you say, on the macro level. I think that converts to the micro level as well.
Thank you, Speaker. It has been very exciting empirical examination of the current reality on the fertility transition and the low fertility. I think we have really learned a lot. Any good event also need to have a closure, so it's already quite late. We understand that you are staying back late. Thank you so much. So without wasting much of my time, let me now call upon Dr. Deepthi Govil to propose a formal vote of thanks. Over to you, Deepthi.
Thank you so much, sir. So respected Professor Peter McDonald, Professor K.S. James, Professor T.V. Shekhar, faculty colleagues, distinguished guests, and respected teachers, and my dear participants. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose the vote of thanks on the occasion of 20th C. Chandrasekaran Memorial Lecture. I, on behalf of Publication Cell of IIPS, Mumbai, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to all those who contributed to the success of this lecture series. At the onset, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Peter McDonald, who wholeheartedly accepted our invitation and spared his valuable time to deliver 20th Professor C. Chandrasekaran Memorial Lecture. We are privileged to have you with us today. At this VR, you are here to enlighten us on this typical demographic phenomena. Your crisp and thought-provoking lecture on low fertility, its origin and its implication has raised several undebatable concerns related to political, social, and environmental insecurities, issues related to labor force, aging, and finally the impact of population decline. I believe these issues and challenges will be useful to motivate our young scholars to work and contemplate on the issues related to low fertility. Thank you so much, sir, once again for agreeing to be the part of this occasion in the memory of Professor C. Chandrasekaran. It's my profound duty to thank all the distinguished participants from the different parts of the globe for their active participation and dynamic discussion to make the lecture a grand success. We look forward for your such enthusiastic participation in upcoming lectures. Thank you very much, everyone, for being present with us today. I am grateful to Professor K.S. James, Director IIPS, to invest trust in us and provided us with the responsibility to execute the lecture series. He has been very, very supportive throughout the preparation and provided his valuable inputs and comments as and when required. A very, very big thanks to Professor T.V. Shekhar for organizing the event on the behalf of Publication Cell of IIPS Mumbai. Under his able leadership and initiative, we will get the opportunity to hear many more scholarly lectures. Thank you so much, sir. In this series, I would like to express my hearty gratitude to the staff of Publication Cell, Dr. Vaidyanathan and Ms. Irene Solomon, to extend their unconditional and timely logistics support in organizing the lecture. Thank you, team, for providing all the necessary support and enabling environment to make this lecture possible. I extend my thanks to the persons from ICT unit, Mr. Anjani and Mr. Avinash and his team for providing technical support for organizing this lecture. With their support, we could have a smooth and uninterrupted virtual sessions, though there was a little bit of disturbance, so sorry for this inconvenience. And I cannot thank everyone enough for their involvement and their willingness to take on the completion of this task beyond this comfort zone. Thank you very much once again, all of you, for attending the lecture. Goodbye and good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you all. And the memorial lecture program is closed. Bye-bye and see you later.